Right now, somewhere under your skin, there's a layer of fat you've probably complained about. Don't. That layer exists because of what you're about to hear. 20,000 years ago, a third of this planet was buried under ice. Not snow. Not a rough winter. Walls of ice over a mile thick. Sitting on land where people are living right now. The humans alive at that moment had no thermal gear. No insulated shelter. No understanding of what a calorie was. They had skin. A fire. And each other. And every biological reason to die. No fur. No claws. No natural cold defense of any kind. And yet here you are. Which means somewhere in that frozen disaster, someone figured something out. That's what this episode is about. Here's something nobody tells you about the Ice Age. It didn't arrive like a catastrophe. It arrived like a season that never ended. 20,000 years before the worst of it, the climate had been mild. Forests, rivers. Predictable seasons. The kind of world your ancestors had spent thousands of years learning to read. They knew which plant meant water nearby. Which track pattern meant food. Which sky meant a storm 3 hours out. That knowledge wasn't written down. It lived in people. Parent to child. Generation to generation. For thousands of years. And then the world started breaking their instructions. Not overnight. Over centuries. Which is the cruelest part. Because nobody alive could remember it being any different. Each generation adapted to a slightly colder version of normal. They didn't know they were walking toward the edge of something catastrophic. The rivers they'd tracked for water froze earlier every year. The animals they'd hunted for generations started moving in directions that made no sense. The plants that had always been there simply stopped being there. Nobody had a word for why. They didn't have a name for an ice age. They just had a world that kept getting harder and no map for what was coming next. Scientists call it the last glacial maximum. Here's what that actually looked like. More than half the planet's surface, covered in ice. Sea levels dropped over 100 meters because so much of Earth's water was frozen solid it simply wasn't in the ocean anymore. Global temperatures fell by 10 degrees Celsius. 10 degrees sounds small until you feel it every single day. For thousands of consecutive winters. Not one bad year. Thousands of winters. Stacked on top of each other. Entire ecosystems that your ancestors had built their survival around simply stopped existing. But here's the part that gets overlooked every time. The cold itself wasn't the main killer. The main killer was unpredictability. One year, a valley had food. The next year, the same valley was empty. And nobody could explain why. Picture being one of those humans. You wake up. Your breath freezes before you stood up. The fire from last night is barely embers. Outside, something bigger, faster, and hungrier than you is surviving the same morning, except it has fur. You don't get a rest day. There is no version of this world where you stay inside. Researchers studying skeletal remains from this exact period found something that should sit with you. Bone-deep evidence of repeated starvation. Not once. Not twice. Generations of it. And yet, you exist. Which means someone didn't die. So how does a species with no fur, no claws, and no cold defense survive a planet actively trying to freeze it? The first answer came from a needle. Not a modern one. A bone needle. Carved from animal bone. No bigger than your finger. Found at sites dated to exactly this period. Archaeologists found them by the dozens. These weren't crude tools. They were precise. Designed for one specific purpose: sewing fitted clothing. Not draping animal skins over your shoulders. Fitted. Sewn. Sealed at the seams to trap body heat inside. That single shift is the difference between waking up alive and not waking up at all. Here's the physics. Fitted clothing creates a warm air layer between your skin and the fabric. Lose that layer through a gap at the wrist or neck, and your core temperature starts dropping. At -20 degrees, that gap kills you before morning. These people figured that out without a thermometer. Without a physics textbook. Without anyone to teach them. Then came the shelters. Not caves they wandered into. Structures they built. Engineered from mammoth bones and animal hide. Designed specifically to block wind and trap warmth inside. Some of these structures were found hundreds of kilometers from any natural cave. They weren't finding shelter. They were building it. In conditions that make modern camping look like a hotel. But here's the decision that might explain more than anything else why you're here right now. When the food disappeared locally, they moved to the coast. Researchers studying sites in South Africa found something that stopped them. During the coldest stretch of the Ice Age, when the interior of the continent had gone almost completely silent, human settlements shifted toward shorelines. Because the ocean kept producing food even when everything else stopped. Same strategy your ancestors used against the volcano in the last episode. When one place stops working, find the place that still does. But the groups that survived longest weren't the ones with the strongest individuals. They were the ones who shared fastest. Who told the next camp where the food was. Who passed down the needle technique. Who shared the shelter design. Who didn't hoard the survival knowledge when hoarding it might have given them an edge. The ones who shared survived. The ones who didn't. Here's what I want you to think about. Every time you put on a jacket, you're using a technology invented by someone trying not to freeze to death. Every wall in every building you've ever been in exists because someone 20,000 years ago decided shelter shouldn't be left to chance. If even one of those groups had failed, no needles, no shelter, no shift to the coast, an entire branch of your family tree disappears. You were never born. Here's the part that never gets told. The Ice Age didn't just test humanity. It upgraded us. The pressure of surviving something that should have erased us forced human groups to cooperate faster, invent faster, pass information faster than any other species on the planet ever had. That pressure, the exact same pressure that should have killed us, is part of why human cognition accelerated across those generations. We're not the descendants of the species that avoided the cold. We're the descendants of the ones who looked at an entire frozen planet and decided to build their way out of it. Bone needles. Mammoth bone shelters. Coastal migration. Shared knowledge. That's the package that kept the human line alive. And then, just when the worst was finally over, the ice started retreating. Temperatures climbed. The world began to thaw. And humanity didn't get to rest. Because what came next was faster, more violent, and in some ways more dangerous than anything the Ice Age had thrown at us. A climate event so sudden, so dramatic, that some researchers believe it reshaped the entire course of human history. That's the next episode.